Fairy tale.
A fairy tale is a type of short story that typically features European folkloric fantasy characters, such as fairies, goblins, elves, trolls, dwarves, giants, witches, mermaids, or gnomes, and usually magic or enchantments. Fairy tales may be distinguished from other folk narratives such as legends and explicitly moral tales, including beast fables. In less technical contexts, the term is also used to describe something blessed with unusual happiness, as in fairy tale ending, a happy ending, or fairy tale romance, though not all fairy tales end happily. Colloquially, a fairy tale, or fairy story can also mean any far-fetched story or tall tale. It's used especially of any story that not only isn't true, but couldn't possibly be true. In cultures where demons and witches are perceived as real, fairy tales may merge into legends, where the narrative is perceived both by teller and hearers as being grounded in historical truth. However, unlike legends and epics, they usually do not contain more than superficial references to religion and actual places, people, and events. They take place once upon a time rather than in actual times. Fairy tales are found in oral and in literary form. The history of the fairy tale is particularly difficult to trace because only the literary forms can survive. Still, the evidence of literary works at least indicates that fairy tales have existed for thousands of years, although not perhaps recognized as a genre. The name fairy tale was first ascribed to them by Madame d'Aulnoy in the late 17th century. Many of today's fairy tales have evolved from centuries-old stories that have appeared, with variations, in multiple cultures around the world. Fairy tales, and works derived from fairy tales, are still written today. The older fairy tales were intended for an audience of adults, as well as children, but they were associated with children as early as the writings of the pre-Caesars. The Brothers Grimm titled their collection Children's and Household Tales, and the link with children has only grown stronger with time. Folklorists have classified fairy tales in various ways. The Arne-Thompson classification system and the morphological analysis of Vladimir Brupp are among the most notable. Other folklorists have interpreted the tale's significance, but no school has been definitively established for the meaning of the tales.
Terminology.
Some folklorists prefer to use the German term Märchen or wonder tale to refer to the genre over fairy tale, a practice given weight by the definition of Thompson in his 1977 edition of the folktale, a tale of some length involving a succession of motifs or episodes. It moves in an unreal world without definite locality or definite creatures and is filled with the marvelous. In this Never Never Land, humble heroes kill adversaries, succeed to kingdoms and marry princesses. The characters and motifs of fairy tales are simple and archetypal, princesses and goose girls, youngest sons and gallant princes, ogres, giants, dragons, and trolls, wicked stepmothers and false heroes, fairy godmothers and other magical helpers, often talking horses, or foxes, or birds, glass mountains, and prohibitions and breaking of prohibitions.
Definition.
Although the fairy tale is a distinct genre within the larger category of folktale, the definition that marks a work as a fairy tale is a source of considerable dispute. One universally agreed upon matter is that fairy tales do not require fairies. The term itself comes from the translation of Madame d'Aulnoy's Contes de Fées, first used in her collection in 1697. Common parlance conflates fairy tales with beast fables and other folk tales, and scholars differ on the degree to which the presence of fairies and or similarly mythical beings, for example, elves, goblins, trolls, giants, huge monsters, should be taken as a differentiator. Vladimir Brupp, in his Morphology of the Folktale, criticized the common distinction between fairy tales and animal tales on the grounds that many tales contained both fantastic elements and animals. Nevertheless, to select works for his analysis, Brupp used all Russian folktales classified as a folklore on Thompson 300-749, in a cataloging system that made such a distinction, to gain a clear set of tales. His own analysis identified fairy tales by their plot elements, but that in itself has been criticized, as the analysis does not lend itself easily to tales that do not involve a quest, and furthermore, the same plot elements are found in non-fairy tale works. As Stith Thompson points out, talking animals in the presence of magic seem to be more common to the fairy tale than fairies themselves. However, the mere presence of animals that talk does not make a tale a fairy tale, especially when the animal is clearly a mask on a human face, as in Fables. In his essay on fairy stories, J.R.R. Tolkien agreed with the exclusion of fairies from the definition, defining fairy tales as stories about the adventures of men in fairy, the land of fairies, fairy tale princes and princesses, dwarves, elves, and not only other magical species but many other marvels. However, the same essay excludes tales that are often considered fairy tales, citing as an example The Monkey's Heart, which Andrew Lang included in the Lilac Fairy book. Stephen Swan-Jones identified the presence of magic as the feature by which fairy tales can be distinguished from other sorts of folk tales. Davidson and Chaudhry identified transformation as the key feature of the genre. From a psychological point of view, Jean Kiriak argued for the necessity of the fantastic in these narratives. In terms of aesthetic values, Italo Calvino cited the fairy tale as a prime example of quickness in literature, because of the economy and concision of the tales.
History of the genre.
Originally, stories that we would now call fairy tales were not marked out as a separate genre. The German term Märchen stems from the Old German word Mar, which means story or tale. The word Märchen is the diminutive of the word Mar, therefore it means a little story. Together with the common beginning once upon a time, it means a fairy tale or a Märchen was originally a little story from long time ago, when the world was still magic. Indeed, one less regular German opening is in the old times when wishing was still effective. The English term fairy tale stems from the fact that the French contes often included fairies. Roots of the genre come from different oral stories passed down in European cultures. The genre was first marked out by writers of the Renaissance, such as Giovanni Francesco Straparola and Giambattista Basile, and stabilized through the works of later collectors such as Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm. In this evolution, the name was coined when the Précieuses took up writing literary stories. Madame d'Aulnoy invented the term conte de fées, or fairy tale, in the late 17th century. Before the definition of the genre of fantasy, many works that would now be classified as fantasy were termed fairy tales, including Tolkien's The Hobbit, George Orwell's Animal Farm, and L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Indeed, Tolkien's on fairy stories includes discussions of world-building and is considered a vital part of fantasy criticism. Although fantasy, particularly the subgenre of fairy tale fantasy, draws heavily on fairy tale motifs, the genres are now regarded as distinct.
Folk and literary.
The fairy tale, told orally, is a subclass of the folk tale. Many writers have written in the form of the fairy tale. These are the literary fairy tales, or Kunstmärchen. The oldest forms, from Painchatantra to the Pentamerone, show considerable reworking from the oral form. The Brothers Grimm were among the first to try to preserve the features of oral tales. Yet the stories printed under the Grimm name have been considerably reworked to fit the written form. Literary fairy tales and oral fairy tales freely exchanged plots, motifs, and elements with one another and with the tales of foreign lands. Many 18th-century folklorists attempted to recover the pure folktale, uncontaminated by literary versions. Yet while oral fairy tales likely existed for thousands of years before the literary forms, there is no pure folktale, and each literary fairy tale draws on folk traditions, if only in parody. This makes it impossible to trace forms of transmission of a fairy tale. Oral storytellers have been known to read literary fairy tales to increase their own stock of stories and treatments.
History.
The oral tradition of the fairy tale came long before the written page. Tales were told or enacted dramatically, rather than written down, and handed down from generation to generation. Because of this, the history of their development is necessarily obscure and fairy tales appear, now and again, in written literature throughout literate cultures, as in the Golden Ass, which includes Cupid and Psyche, Roman, 100 to 200 AD, or the Panchatantra, India 3rd century BCE, but it is unknown to what extent these reflect the actual folktales even of their own time. The stylistic evidence indicates that these, and many later collections, reworked folktales into literary forms. What they do show is that the fairy tale has ancient roots, older than the Arabian Nights collection of magical tales, compiled circa 1500 AD, such as Vikram and the Vampire, and Bel and the Dragon. Besides such collections and individual tales, in China, Taoist philosophers such as Lizi and Zhuangzi recounted fairy tales in their philosophical works. In the broader definition of the genre, the first famous Western fairy tales are those of Aesop, 6th century BC, in ancient Greece. Jack Zips writes in When Dreams Came True, there are fairy tale elements in Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, and in many of William Shakespeare plays. King Lear can be considered a literary variant of fairy tales such as Water and Salt and Capo Rushes. The tale itself resurfaced in Western literature in the 16th and 17th centuries, with the facetious Knights of Straparola by Giovanni Francesco Straparola, Italy, 1550 and 1553, which contains many fairy tales in its insert tales, and the Neapolitan tales of Giambattista Basile, Naples, 1634-6, which are all fairy tales. Carlo Gozzi made use of many fairy tale motifs among his commedia dell'arte scenarios, including among them one based on The Love for Three Oranges, 1761. Simultaneously, Pu Songling, in China, included many fairy tales in his collection, Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, published posthumously, 1766. The fairy tale itself became popular among the précieuses of upper-class France, 1690 to 1710, and among the tales told in that time were the ones of La Fontaine and the contes of Charles Perrault, 1697, who fixed the forms of Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella. Although Straparola's, Basile's and Perrault's collections contain the oldest known forms of various fairy tales, on the stylistic evidence, all the writers rewrote the tales for literary effect.
The Salon era.
In the mid-17th century, a vogue for magical tales emerged among the intellectuals who frequented the salons of Paris. These salons were regular gatherings hosted by prominent aristocratic women, where women and men could gather together to discuss the issues of the day. In the 1630s, aristocratic women began to gather in their own living rooms, salons, in order to discuss the topics of their choice, arts and letters, politics, and social matters of immediate concern to the women of their class, marriage, love, financial and physical independence, and access to education. This was a time when women were barred from receiving a formal education. Some of the most gifted women writers of the period came out of these early salons, such as Madeleine de Scudéry and Madame de Lafayette, which encouraged women's independence and pushed against the gender barriers that defined their lives. The saloniers argued particularly for love and intellectual compatibility between the sexes, opposing the system of arranged marriages. Sometime in the middle of the 17th century, a passion for the conversational parlor game based on the plots of old folk tales swept through the salons. Each salonier was called upon to retell an old tale or rework an old theme, spinning clever new stories that not only showcased verbal agility and imagination, but also slyly commented on the conditions of aristocratic life. Great emphasis was placed on a mode of delivery that seemed natural and spontaneous. The decorative language of the fairy tales served an important function, disguising the rebellious subtext of the stories and sliding them past the court censors. Critiques of court life, and even of the king, were embedded in extravagant tales and in dark, sharply dystopian ones. Not surprisingly, the tales by women often featured young, but clever, aristocratic girls whose lives were controlled by the arbitrary whims of fathers, kings, and elderly wicked fairies. As well as tales in which groups of wise fairies, that is, intelligent, independent women, stepped in and put all to rights. Fortunately, The Salon tales as they were originally written and published have been preserved for us in a monumental work called Les Cabinets de Fées, an enormous collection of stories from the 17th and 18th centuries.
Later works.
The first collectors to attempt to preserve not only the plot and characters of the tale, but also the style in which they were told, were the Brothers Grimm, collecting German fairy tales. Ironically, this meant although their first edition, 1812 and 1815, remains a treasure for folklorists, they rewrote the tales in later editions to make them more acceptable, which ensured their sales and the later popularity of their work. Such literary forms did not merely draw from the folktale, but also influenced folktales in turn. The Brothers Grimm rejected several tales for their collection, though told orally to them by Germans, because the tales derived from Perrault, and they concluded they were thereby French and not German tales. An oral version of Bluebeard was thus rejected, and the tale of Little Briar Rose, clearly related to Perrault's The Sleeping Beauty, was included only because Jacob Grimm convinced his brother that the figure of Brynhild, from much earlier Norse mythology, proved that the sleeping princess was authentically Germanic folklore. This consideration of whether to keep Sleeping Beauty reflected a belief common among folklorists of the 19th century, that the folk tradition preserved fairy tales in forms from prehistory except when contaminated by such literary forms, leading people to tell inauthentic tales. The rural, illiterate, and uneducated peasants, if suitably isolated, were the folk and would tell pure folk tales. Sometimes they regarded fairy tales as a form of fossil, the remnants of a once perfect tale. However, further research has concluded that fairy tales never had a fixed form, and regardless of literary influence, the tellers constantly altered them for their own purposes. The work of the Brothers Grimm influenced other collectors, both inspiring them to collect tales and leading them to similarly believe, in a spirit of romantic nationalism, that the fairy tales of a country were particularly representative of it, to the neglect of cross-cultural influence. Among those influenced were the Russian Alexander Afanasiev, first published in 1866, the Norwegians Peter Christen Asbjørnsen and Jørgen Moe, first published in 1845, the Romanian Peter Asperescu, first published in 1874, the English Joseph Jacobs, first published in 1890, and Jeremiah Curtin, an American who collected Irish tales, first published in 1890. Ethnographers collected fairy tales over the world, finding similar tales in Africa, the Americas, and Australia. Andrew Lang was able to draw on not only the written tales of Europe and Asia, but those collected by ethnographers, to fill his colored fairy book series. They also encouraged other collectors of fairy tales, as when Yi Theodore Ozaki created a collection, Japanese Fairy Tales, 1908, after encouragement from Lang. Simultaneously, writers such as Hans Christian Andersen and George MacDonald continued the tradition of literary fairy tales. Andersen's works sometimes drew on old folk tales, but more often deployed fairy tale motifs and plots in new tales. MacDonald incorporated fairy tale motifs both in new literary fairy tales, such as The Light Princess, and in works of the genre that would become fantasy, as in The Princess and the Goblin or Lilith.
Cross-cultural transmission.
Two theories of origins have attempted to explain the common elements in fairy tales found spread over continents. One is that a single point of origin generated any given tale, which then spread over the centuries. The other is that such fairy tales stem from common human experience and therefore can appear separately in many different origins. Fairy tales with very similar plots, characters, and motifs are found spread across many different cultures. Many researchers hold this to be caused by the spread of such tales, as people repeat tales they have heard in foreign lands, although the oral nature makes it impossible to trace the root except by inference. Folklorists have attempted to determine the origin by internal evidence, which can not always be clear. Joseph Jacobs, comparing the Scottish tale The Rider of Riddles with the version collected by the Brothers Grimm, The Riddle, noted that in The Rider of Riddles one hero ends up polygamously married, which might point to an ancient custom, but in the riddle, the simpler riddle might argue greater antiquity. folklorists of the Finnish, or historical geographical, school attempted to place fairy tales to their origin, with inconclusive results. Sometimes influence, especially within a limited area and time, is clearer, as when considering the influence of Perrault's tales on those collected by the Brothers Grimm. Little Briar Rose appears to stem from Perrault's The Sleeping Beauty, as the Grimm's tale appears to be the only independent German variant. Similarly, the close agreement between the opening of Grimm's version of Little Red Riding Hood and Perrault's tale points to an influence, although Grimm's version adds a different ending, perhaps derived from The Wolf and the Seven Young Kids. Fairy tales also tend to take on the color of their location, through the choice of motifs, the style in which they are told, and the depiction of character and local color.
Association with children.
Originally, adults were the audience of a fairy tale just as often as children. Literary fairy tales appeared in works intended for adults, but in the 19th and 20th centuries the fairy tale became associated with children's literature. The princesses, including Madame d'Aulnoy, intended their works for adults, but regarded their source as the tales that servants, or other women of lower class, would tell to children. Indeed, a novel of that time, depicting a countess's suitor offering to tell such a tale, has the countess exclaimed that she loves fairy tales as if she was still a child. Among the late princesses, Jeanne-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont redacted a version of Beauty and the Beast for children, and it is her tale that is best known today. The Brothers Grimm titled their collection Children's and Household Tales and rewrote their tales after complaints that they were not suitable for children. In the modern era, fairy tales were altered so that they could be read to children. The Brothers Grimm concentrated mostly on sexual references. Rapunzel, in the first edition, revealed the prince's visits by asking why her clothing had grown tight, thus letting the witch deduce that she was pregnant, but in subsequent editions carelessly revealed that it was easier to pull up the prince than the witch. On the other hand, in many respects, violence, particularly when punishing villains, was increased. Other, later, revisions cut out violence. J.R.R. Tolkien noted that the juniper tree often had its cannibalistic stew cut out in a version intended for children. The moralizing strain in the Victorian era altered the classical tales to teach lessons, as when George Cruikshank rewrote Cinderella in 1854 to contain temperance themes. His acquaintance Charles Dickens protested, in an utilitarian age, of all other times, it is a matter of grave importance that fairy tales should be respected. Psychoanalysts such as Bruno Bettelheim, who regarded the cruelty of older fairy tales as indicative of psychological conflicts, strongly criticized this expurgation, because it weakened their usefulness to both children and adults as ways of symbolically resolving issues. The adaptation of fairy tales for children continues. Walt Disney's influential Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was largely, although certainly not solely, intended for the children's market. The anime magical princess Minky Momo draws on the fairy tale Momotaro. Jack Zips has spent many years working to make the older traditional stories accessible to modern readers and their children.
Contemporary tales. Literary.
In contemporary literature, many authors have used the form of fairy tales for various reasons, such as examining the human condition from the simple framework a fairy tale provides. Some authors seek to recreate a sense of the fantastic in a contemporary discourse. Some writers use fairy tale forms for modern issues. This can include using the psychological dramas implicit in the story, as when Robin McKinley retold Donkey Skin as the novel Deerskin, with emphasis on the abusive treatment the father of the tale dealt to his daughter. Sometimes, especially in children's literature, fairy tales are retold with a twist simply for comic effect, such as The Stinky Cheese Man by John Siska and the ASBO fairy tales by Chris Pilbeam. A common comic motif is a world where all the fairy tales take place, and the characters are aware of their role in the story, such as in the film series Shrek. Other authors may have specific motives, such as multicultural or feminist re-evaluations of predominantly Eurocentric masculine-dominated fairy tales, implying critique of older narratives. a figure of the damsel in distress has been particularly attacked by many feminist critics. Examples of narrative reversal rejecting this figure include The Paper Bag Princess by Robert Munsch, a picture book aimed at children in which a princess rescues a prince, and Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, which retells a number of fairy tales from a female point of view. It may be hard to lay down the rule between fairy tales and fantasies that use fairy tale motifs, or even whole plots, but the distinction is commonly made, even within the works of a single author. George MacDonald's Lilith and Fantastes are regarded as fantasies, while his The Light Princess, The Golden Key, and The Wise Woman are commonly called fairy tales. The most notable distinction is that fairy tale fantasies, like other fantasies, make use of novelistic writing conventions of prose, characterization, or setting.
Film.
Fairy tales have been enacted dramatically. Records exist of this in commedia dell'arte, and later in pantomime. The advent of cinema has meant that such stories could be presented in a more plausible manner, with the use of special effects and animation. The Disney movie Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937 was a groundbreaking film for fairy tales and, indeed, fantasy in general. Disney's influence helped establish this genre as a children's genre, and has been blamed for simplification of fairy tales ending in situations where everything goes right, as opposed to the pain and suffering, and sometimes unhappy endings, of many folk fairy tales. Many filmed fairy tales have been made primarily for children, from Disney's later works to Alexandrou's retelling of Vasilissa the Beautiful, the first Soviet film to use Russian folk tales in a big-budget feature. Others have used the conventions of fairy tales to create new stories with sentiments more relevant to contemporary life, as in Labyrinth, My Neighbor Totoro, the films of Michel Ocelot, and Happily Ever After. Other works have retold familiar fairy tales in a darker, more horrific or psychological variant aimed primarily at adults. Notable examples are Jean Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast and the Company of Wolves, based on an Angela Carter's retelling of Little Red Riding Hood. Likewise, Princess Mononoke, Pan's Labyrinth, Suspiria, and Spike create new stories in this genre from fairy tale and folklore motifs. In comics and animated TV series, The Sandman, Revolutionary Girl Utena, Princess Tutu, Fables and Mar all make use of standard fairy tale elements to various extents but are more accurately categorized as fairy tale fantasy due to the definite locations and characters which a longer narrative requires. A more modern cinematic fairy tale would be Luciano Visconti's La Notte Bianca, starring Marcello Mastroianni before he became a superstar. It involves many of the romantic conventions of fairy tales, yet it takes place in post-World War II Italy, and it ends realistically.
Motifs.
Any comparison of fairy tales quickly discovers that many fairy tales have features in common with each other. Two of the most influential classifications are those of Auntie-Anne, as revised by Stith Thompson into the Anne-Thompson classification system, and Vladimir Prip's Morphology of the folk tale.
Aune-Thompson.
This system groups fairy and folk tales according to their overall plot. Common, identifying features are picked out to decide which tales are grouped together. Much therefore depends on what features are regarded as decisive. For instance, tales like Cinderella, in which a persecuted heroine, with the help of the fairy godmother or similar magical helper, attends an event, or 3, in which she wins the love of a prince and is identified as his true bride, are classified as Type 510, the persecuted heroine. Some such tales are The Wonderful Birch, Aschenputtel, Katie Woodencloak, The Story of Tam and Cam, Yixian, Capo Rushes, Catskin, Fair, Brown and Trembling, Finette Cendron, Alleliror. Further analysis of the tales shows that in Cinderella, The Wonderful Birch, The Story of Tam and Cam, Yixian, and Aschenputtel, the heroine is persecuted by her stepmother and refused permission to go to the ball or other event, and in Fair, Brown and Trembling and Finette Cendron by her sisters and other female figures, and these are grouped as 510A. While in Capo Rushes, Catskin, and Alleliror, The heroine is driven from home by her father's persecutions, and must take work in a kitchen elsewhere, and these are grouped as 510b. But in Katie Woodencloak, she is driven from home by her stepmother's persecutions and must take service in a kitchen elsewhere, and in Tattercoats, she is refused permission to go to the ball by her grandfather. Given these features common with both types of 510, Katie Woodencloak is classified as 510A because the villain is the stepmother, and Tattercoats as 510B because the grandfather fills the father's role. This system has its weaknesses in the difficulty of having no way to classify subportions of a tale as motifs. Rapunzel is type 310, the maiden in the tower, but it opens with a child being demanded in return for stolen food, as does Pardocki. But Pardocki is not a maiden in the tower tale, while the Canary Prince, which opens with a jealous stepmother, is. It also lends itself to emphasis on the common elements, to the extent that the folklorist describes the Black Bull of Norroway as the same story as Beauty and the Beast. This can be useful as a shorthand but can also erase the coloring and details of a story.
Morphology.
Vladimir Prupp specifically studied a collection of Russian fairy tales, but his analysis has been found useful for the tales of other countries. Having criticized Thompson-type analysis for ignoring what motifs did in stories, and because the motifs used were not clearly distinct, he analyzed the tales for the function each character and action fulfilled and concluded that a tale was composed of 31 elements, functions and 7 characters or spheres of action. The princess and her father are a single sphere. While the elements were not all required for all tales, when they appeared they did so in an invariant order, except that each individual element might be negated twice, so that it would appear 3 times, as when, in Brother and Sister, the brother resists drinking from enchanted streams twice, so that it is the third that enchants him. Prupp's 31 functions also fall within 6 stages: preparation, complication, transference, struggle, return, recognition, and a stage can also be repeated, which can affect the perceived order of elements. One such element is the donor who gives the hero magical assistance, often after testing him. In The Golden Bird, the talking fox tests the hero by warning him against entering an inn and, after he succeeds, helps him find the object of his quest. In The Boy Who Drew Cats, the priest advised the hero to stay in small places at night, which protects him from an evil spirit. In Cinderella, the fairy godmother gives Cinderella the dresses she needs to attend the ball, as their mother's spirits do in Bawang Pusha Bawang Mora and the Wonderful Birch. In The Fox Sister, a Buddhist monk gives the brothers magical bottles to protect against the fox spirit. The roles can be more complicated. In The Red Ettin, the role is split into the mother, who offers the hero the whole of a journey cake with her curse or half with her blessing, and when he takes the half, a fairy who gives him advice. In Mr. Samigdali, the sun, the moon, and the stars all give the heroine a magical gift. Characters who are not always the donor can act like the donor. In Callow and the Goblins, the villain goblins also give the heroine gifts, because they are tricked. In Shippayataro, the evil cats betray their secret to the hero, giving him the means to defeat them. Other fairy tales, such as the story of the youth who went forth to learn what fear was, do not feature the donor. Analogies have been drawn between this and the analysis of myths into the hero's journey. This analysis has been criticized for ignoring tone, mood, characters and, indeed, anything that differentiates one fairy tale from another.
Interpretations.
Many fairy tales have been interpreted for their purported significance. One mythological interpretation claimed that many fairy tales, including Hansel and Gretel, Sleeping Beauty, and The Frog King, all were solar myths. This mode of interpretation is rather less popular now. Many have also been subjected to Freudian, Jungian, and other psychological analyses, but no mode of interpretation has ever established itself definitively. Specific analyses have often been criticized for lending great importance to motifs that are not, in fact, integral to the tale. This has often stemmed from treating one instance of a fairy tale as the definitive text, where the tale has been told and retold in many variations. In variants of Bluebeard, the wife's curiosity is betrayed by a blood-stained key, by an egg's breaking, or by the singing of a rose she wore, without affecting the tale, but interpretations of specific variants have claimed that the precise object is integral to the tale. Other folklorists have interpreted tales as historical documents. Many German folklorists, believing the tales to have been preserved from ancient times, used Grimm's tales to explain ancient customs. Other folklorists have explained the figure of the wicked stepmother historically. Many women did die in childbirth, their husbands remarried, and their new stepmothers competed with the children of the first marriage for resources. In a 2012 lecture, Jack Zips reads fairy tales as examples of what he calls childism. He suggests that there are terrible aspects to the tales, which, among other things, have conditioned children to accept mistreatment and even abuse.
Compilations.
Authors and works. Mixed Up Fairy Tales, Alan Garner's Book of British Fairy Tales, United Kingdom, 1984, by Alan Garner, Fairy Tales, USA, 1965, by E. E. Cummings, Fairy Tales, now first collected, to which are prefixed two dissertations, 1. On Pygmies 2. On Fairies, England, 1831, by Joseph Ritson, Giovanni Francesco Straparola, Italy, 16th century, Grimm's Fairy Tales, Germany, 1812–1857, Hans Christian Andersen, Denmark, 1805–1875, Italian Folktales, Italy, 1956, by Italo Calvino, Joseph Jacobs, 1854–1916, Legend Sălbăsmul Romanila, Romania, 1874, by Peter Asperescu, Madame d'Aulnoy, France, 1650–1705, Norwegian Folktales, Norway, 1845–1870, by Peter Christen Asbjørnsen and Jørgen Moe, Narodnruski Skazki, Russia, 1855–1863, by Alexander Afanasiev, Pentamerone, Italy, 1634–1636, by Giambattista Basile, Charles Perrault, France, 1628–1703, Painchatantra, India, 3rd century BCE, Popular Tales of the West Highlands, Scotland, 1862, by John Francis Campbell, Ruth Manning Sanders, Wales, 1886–1988, Franz Xaver von Schonath, Germany, 1810–1886, Kunio Yanagita, Japan, 1875–1962, World Tales, United Kingdom, 1979,